First of all, an update that's breaking now from the Associated Press. We will not call the Associated Press the Associated Press until it recognizes the Gulf of America as the Gulf of America. The crew of the Army helicopter that collided in midair with an American Airlines jet near Washington, D.C. Ronald Reagan Airport may have had inaccurate altitude readings in the moments before the crash, and also may have not heard key instructions from the air traffic controllers to move behind the plane, investigators said. This is breaking news. National Transportation Safety Board Chairwoman Jennifer Homendy told reporters that the recording from the Black Hawk helicopter cockpit suggested an incomplete radio transmission may have left the crew without understanding how it should shift position just before the January 6th crash in which all 67 aboard their two aircrafts were killed. The transmission was interrupted. It was stepped on, she said, leaving them unable to hear the words, quote, pass behind the, because the helicopter's microphone key was pressed at the same moment. Hamidi said the helicopter was on a check flight that night, where the pilot was ongoing an annual test, and a test on using night vision goggles. Investigators believe the crew was wearing night vision goggles throughout the flight. Let me continue here. It will take more than a year to get the final NTSB report on the collision, and Hamidi warned reporters that many issues were still being probed. We're only a couple weeks out from the crash, he said. We have a lot of work to do. So let me just repeat that they're looking at the possibility there may have been bad data, she said. Bad data meaning they didn't know how high they were. The collision likely occurred at an altitude of about 325 feet, which will put the Black Hawk above its 200-foot limit for the location. Cockpit conversations a few minutes before the crash indicated conflicting altitude data, Hamidi said, with the helicopter's pilot calling out that they were at 300 feet, but the instructor pilot saying it was 400 feet. We're looking at the possibility there may have been bad data. Now, that generation of Black Hawks typically has two types of altimeters, one relying on barometric pressure and the other on radio frequency signals bounced off the ground. Helicopter pilots typically rely on barometric readings while flying, but the helicopter's black box captures its radio altitude. The radio altitude at the time of the impact put the helicopter at 278 feet. But I want to caution, she said, that doesn't mean that's what the Black Hawk crew was seeing on the barometric altimeters in the cockpit. Now, the Army also said the Black Hawk crew was highly experienced and accustomed to the crowded skies around the nation's capital. Cholera, don't worry. All right, so now we're knowing that some of the information they may have had was inaccurate. And some of the information they received, not just on the equipment, but some of the information they received, or that was sent, I should say, was actually not received. It was stepped on, she says. Now, reading between the lines, I suppose what that means is you're pressing down a button to speak at the same time the information's coming in. It's not explained any further by the Associated Press. But nonetheless, there may have been a technical problem with the information that was received by the helicopter before it slammed into the to the airline. So the collision occurred at about 325 feet. The helicopter's pilot calling out that they were at 300 feet, but the instructor said they were at 400 feet. They knew they were in trouble. I mean, with nanoseconds before the crash, they knew they were in trouble. Is my guess from reading this information, that just breaking information from the Associated Press. All right. There's a lot of loose ends out there, and I want to address some of them. So there was a decision by the Department of Justice that the case against the mayor of New York ought to be dropped, that the case against Adams should be dropped. That was communicated to the Southern District of New York, the U.S. Attorney's Office there, and the acting U.S. Attorney has resigned in a long letter, apparently, explaining why she resigned. A couple of people at the Department of Justice, I suppose they're still, sympathizers to the prior regime, I guess. They resigned. Hey, they're welcome to all resign. That clears things up pretty easily. But I want to address something because there's some confusion here. The United States Attorney's Office is not in charge of prosecutions. The Attorney General's in charge of prosecutions. That's the hierarchy. That's how it works. Now, the Attorney General, as a practical matter, cannot be involved in all the decisions that are made by the 93 U.S. attorneys and their various offices. And so that power is effectively delegated. While the U.S. attorneys are presidential appointees, the fact is that they ultimately report to the Attorney General, who ultimately reports to the President. And so there have been some writings by leftists and never-Trumpers alike saying that this was clearly a political decision. Well, it's fascinating how they know these things. I don't know who they interviewed. Did they interview the Attorney General? Did they interview the Deputy Attorney Generals, the individuals in that office? Did they interview the President? They didn't interview anybody. That's what they say it was. And then they play semantics with statements that are made by the Department of Justice. But I can tell you this as somebody who was Chief of Staff to an Attorney General. There were occasions when U.S. attorneys' offices did bring cases that were problematic in many ways, not often, but in many ways, to Main Justice. And that Main Justice did step in or took actions after the fact to deal with what took place in the U.S. Attorney's Office, or for that matter, in the Criminal Division, the Public Integrity Section as well, at Main Justice. The U.S. Attorney's Office is not an independent entity, independent from the rest of the government. It's part of the executive branch. Whether federal prosecutors like it or not, they do answer to somebody else. And the idea that they beat their chests and back themselves and pat themselves on their backs about how they make decisions that are purely in the interest of the public, how they make decisions that are purely based on the facts and the law, well, maybe some do and maybe some don't. Maybe they mostly do. But so what? They still are held to account. So to say this was a political decision and nothing more is to say nothing. You folks know, as soon as I read that indictment, I told you this is weak. I read the entire thing. Wasn't that big of a deal. Didn't require a lot of brain power. A lot of picky, almost silly stuff in there about bribery. And I'm not the only one who came to this conclusion. Other highly experienced attorneys, including defense counsel, including constitutional scholars, including some former federal prosecutors, came to the same conclusion, that this was a Mickey Mouse case. The lawyers who represented Governor Bob McConnell, who was faced with one of these Mickey Mouse cases, cost him his governorship, probably his marriage, went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court unanimously overrode it. You may recall the prosecutor was Smith, Jack Smith. And yet the prosecutors thought, they're doing God's work. I mean, after all, the federal district judge oversaw it, and he was okay with everything, but it wasn't okay. It was terrible. They basically rewrote the bribery statute to include meetings. I won't get into all the details, but I'm very, very familiar with this case. Or maybe the late Senator Ted Stevens, where he was prosecuted out of the Public Integrity Section of Main Justice. But there was a little problem with that case. The prosecutors withheld evidence that was helpful to the senator, that proved his defense, and they withheld it. And they were admonished. One of them, I believe, took his or her own life. And God knows what else happened. But that was a disaster. It was terrible. And there are many other cases. I can remember when I was at Justice. There was a NASA administrator by the name of James Beggs. And he'd been indicted for his work, I believe it was as a senior executive at General Dynamics, if I recollect properly. And that poor man was hounded out of his position. His reputation was destroyed. He went broke virtually. His family suffered. He suffered. And then 17 months later, the federal prosecutor said, well, you know what? I don't think we have enough. We'll drop the case. We'll drop the case? So disgusted and appalled was Attorney General Meese. If it wasn't his last act as Attorney General, it was nearly his last act. He called me into his office. I was his chief of staff. He said, please bring a pen and paper, which I did. We didn't have all these laptops and iPhones back then. And he dictated a letter to me. We were only a couple of the people left out of the political appointees in the Reagan Justice Department on the Attorney General floor there. And I wrote out the letter, and we issued it. It was a profound apology, I believe was the phraseology, a profound apology to Jim Beggs, who he said was a completely innocent man who was wronged by federal prosecutors. Attorney General Meese had originally asked William Weld, who'd been the head of the criminal division at the time, as the assistant attorney general. He went on to stab Meese in the back and to become governor of Massachusetts. I don't know what street he lives on these days. Probably selling cigarettes or something of the kind. I just don't know. Weld refused to. So Meese did it instead. I remember him saying to me, did we ever write that letter apologizing to Beggs for that horrendous attack on him? I said, no. He said, well, I'm going to do it now. And so upon reading the charges against Adams, which is what I suspect happened, like so many of the rest of us, a different conclusion was reached by the new Department of Justice and the Deputy Attorney General's office. Why the Deputy Attorney General's office? Because traditionally, the criminal federal elements are within the auspices and the management of the Deputy Attorney General, where the other elements and the civil elements are under the Associate Attorney General. The deputy's number 2, the associate's the number 3. And they made a decision that they were not going to pursue the case against Adams. And yet you have never Trumpers, and you have the left and the media. They jumped to the conclusion that this was pure politics, that they just wanted to help Adams because he had a better position when it was coming to immigration and so forth and so on. That had nothing to do with it. I'm sure. It was a bad case. And, of course, on the way out the door, the leaks come from the Southern District of New York, and it's known for its incessant leaks. And they say, and we were going to bring other charges against him. Of course they were, like destruction of evidence. You know how they throw on the process crimes. Oh, yes, obstruction of evidence with his iPhone and all the rest of it, as they were going to pile on the charges. Too bad. Too bad. The problem was the case in the first place. In the first place, was a weak case, and it looked highly political to me, and I said it at the time. And it takes a lot of guts to pull back once the trigger's been pulled, because you take a lot of hits. You're accused of a lot of things by people who pretend that they know better, and they know nothing. I'm no special pleader for Adams. I don't give a damn about the guy. I just don't, one way or the other. I don't know him. I don't seek to know him. I think he's been a relatively incompetent mayor, quite frankly. But at least he's not DeCamio, who's a complete nut job. I mean, that's the standard. At least he's not him. But that's my take